The Alchemy of Suffering. How Imam Ghazali's crisis unlocks your purpose. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Sufi Essence. In life, we are all confronted with a universal and inescapable question. Why do we suffer? We all experience loss, failure, illness, and moments of profound spiritual and emotional turmoil. In these moments, it is easy to fall into despair and to believe that our suffering is a meaningless punishment. But what if we are looking at it all wrong? What if suffering is not a sign of Allah's absence, but a powerful catalyst for His presence? What if our deepest pain holds the key to our greatest purpose? Today, we will journey into the heart of one of the most famous spiritual crises in Islamic history, that of the great master Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. At the height of his fame, power, and intellectual prowess, he experienced a spiritual and emotional breakdown, so severe it nearly destroyed him. But through this crisis, he discovered a profound spiritual truth, and in doing so, he became the ultimate alchemist, turning his personal lead of suffering into the spiritual gold of divine purpose. This is a lecture on how to find the purpose and meaning hidden in your own pain, and in doing so, to embark on your own path of spiritual alchemy. Part 1. The Intellectual's Crisis. To understand the magnitude of Imam Ghazali's crisis, we must first understand the man he was before it. At the age of 34, he was at the zenith of his career. He was the head professor at the Nizamiya University in Baghdad, the most prestigious academic post in the Islamic world at the time. He was a brilliant intellectual, a master of Islamic jurisprudence, philosophy, and theology. He was famous, wealthy, and had the ear of the most powerful people in the empire. From the outside, he was a man who had it all. He was the embodiment of success and worldly achievement. However, beneath this veneer of success, a profound crisis was brewing in his heart. In his autobiographical work, Al-Munqidh al-Dalal, Deliverance from Error, he describes a growing feeling of emptiness. He realized that his knowledge was purely intellectual. It resided in his head, not in his heart. He was a master of debating theological points, but he felt a terrifying disconnect between the knowledge he possessed and a direct experiential certainty of Allah. He began to question the very foundations of his faith, not from a place of intellectual doubt, but from a place of spiritual desolation. He felt a deep hypocrisy in his life. He was teaching others about sincerity and the love of Allah, yet his own heart was filled with the love of fame, status, and worldly possessions. This was the first act of suffering in his story. It was not a physical ailment or a loss of wealth. It was an existential pain, a deep inner turmoil that comes from the realization that the life you have built is not the life you were meant to live. This internal conflict between his outer success and his inner emptiness was the fire that would soon begin the process of alchemy. Part 2. The spiritual paralysis. This inner conflict eventually manifested in a severe physical and psychological breakdown. As he recounts in Deliverance from Error, his crisis reached a peak in the year 1095 CE. He was preparing to teach a class one day when he became so paralyzed by doubt and fear that he could no longer speak. He literally lost his voice. His physical body began to reflect the state of his soul. He lost his appetite and his ability to eat. The doctors diagnosed him with an uncurable physical illness, but Ghazali knew the truth. His sickness was a spiritual one. His body was simply echoing the death of his spirit. This was a moment of profound humiliation for a man who had built his entire identity on his intellectual prowess and his ability to command an audience. This spiritual paralysis was the necessary death of his ego nafs. It was an undeniable sign that the path he was on, the path of intellectual pride and worldly fame, was a path to spiritual disaster. It was the moment his suffering became so acute that he had no choice but to surrender. The ego, which had been his master for so long, was now broken and silenced. This moment of complete spiritual bankruptcy was not the end of his story. It was the beginning. It was in this state of complete powerlessness and surrender that the true work of alchemy began. The lead of his worldly life had been melted down in the fire of his suffering, and he was now in a state of pure, malleable potential, ready to be reshaped by the hands of the divine. Part 3. The Alchemy of Detachment. The first and most radical step in Ghazali's spiritual alchemy was his act of complete and total detachment. He made the monumental decision to leave everything behind. He resigned from his esteemed position, abandoned his wealth and prestige, and left Baghdad on the pretext of going on a pilgrimage to Makkah. Reality, he began a decade-long journey of solitude and self-purification. This act of detachment was not an escape from his problems. It was a confrontation with them. It was his way of telling his ego that it would no longer be in charge. This act of renunciation is a key principle of Sufi alchemy. The alchemist must first separate the impure elements from the pure. For Ghazali, the impure elements were his love of status, his intellectual pride, and his attachment to the praise of men. He realized that as long as he held on to these things, his heart would never be free to love Allah alone. He chose solitude to create a sacred space where the voice of his ego could finally be quieted, and the voice of his heart could finally be heard. In the desert, he shed the identity of Imam Ghazali, the famous intellectual, and became simply a seeker of truth. He exchanged his fine robes for the simple woolen cloak of the Sufi. He began to learn not from books, but from direct experience. He began to learn not from a desire to win a debate, but from a profound longing to know and love his Creator, right? This radical act of detachment was the first step in his spiritual transformation, turning the poison of his worldly attachments into the medicine of spiritual freedom. Part 4. The Path of Action and Contemplation. During his 10 years of wandering, Ghazali did not simply run from his past, actively engaged in the spiritual practices that would transform his inner world. He spent his time in solitude and deep contemplation, muraqabah, in the constant remembrance of Allah dhikr, and in rigorous asceticism. This was not a passive retreat. It was an active and deliberate journey of inner work. He realized that intellectual knowledge alone was not enough. He needed to move from a knowledge about Allah to a direct, experiential knowledge of Allah. He began to study the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet PBUH with a new lens, not for the sake of intellectual debate, but for the sake of spiritual purification. He came to understand that the path of the Sufis, which he had previously dismissed as unscholarly, was the only path that could lead him to the certainty and peace his heart craved. The Alchemy of Suffering taught him that true knowledge is not what we store in our minds, but what we live with our hearts. He was no longer a philosopher searching for abstract truth. He was a lover searching for his beloved. His suffering had broken the chains of his intellect and had set his heart free. His years of solitude and devotion were the furnace in which his new purpose was forged, and the spiritual disciplines he practiced were the sacred tools of his alchemy. Part 5. The Return and the Alchemist's Gift. After a decade of profound inner work, Ghazali's transformation was complete. Returned to the world, but he was not the same man who had left it. He was no longer a slave to his ego, and he no longer sought the praise of men. He came back with a new purpose, a purpose born directly from his suffering. His new mission was to reconcile the outward practice of Islamic law with the inward reality of Sufi spirituality. He began to write his magnum opus, Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of religious sciences. This book was the greatest gift he gave to the Islamic world, and it was a direct product of his spiritual crisis. In this book, he systematically dismantled the notion that intellectualism alone could lead to spiritual truth. He showed that true Islam is a living, breathing faith that requires both the mind and the heart, both the outer forms of worship and the inner reality of devotion. His suffering was not a weakness, but a source of profound wisdom. He had experienced the emptiness of a life without a spiritual core, and he came back to guide others away from the same mistake. He had transformed his personal pain into a universal medicine, and his crisis, which was meant to destroy him, became the very thing that made him a legend. His story is a powerful testimony to the fact that our greatest purpose is often found on the other side of our greatest pain. Part 6. Your Inner Ghazali. The Purpose of Your Pain. Imam Ghazali's story is not just a historical account. It is a timeless map for every one of us. It may not have a prestigious academic post, but we all have a Ghazali crisis in our lives. We all have moments of suffering, a career setback, a failed relationship, a personal illness, or a deep sense of meaninglessness that strip away our worldly identity and force us to confront a deeper truth. The alchemical process of suffering is a universal law of spiritual transformation. It works by breaking down the parts of our ego that are not serving us, creating a void that can only be filled by a divine presence. Your pain is not a mistake. It is a sacred tool that is working to reveal your true purpose. The purpose of your pain is to turn you away from the illusions of this world and to turn you toward your Creator. The purpose of your pain is to break your heart open so that a deeper, more profound love can take its place. The key is not to run from your suffering, but to embrace it with the understanding that it is a gift from Allah. It is to surrender your ego in the midst of your pain and to ask Allah to show you the hidden meaning in your trial. This is the moment of alchemy, the moment you begin to transform the lead of your suffering into the spiritual gold of your purpose. Part 7. Conclusion. Imam Ghazali's life is a powerful testament to the alchemical power of suffering. He taught us that our worldly attachments are a spiritual disease, and that the pain that comes from their removal is the medicine that can heal our hearts. His crisis was not an end, but a beginning, and it was his greatest gift to humanity. In this lecture, we have explored the intellectual and spiritual crisis of Imam Ghazali, the transformative power of his radical detachment and renunciation, his path of action and contemplation in solitude, his return to the world with a new purpose forged by his pain, and the universal truth that our own suffering can be the catalyst for discovering our unique divine purpose. Your suffering is not meaningless. It is a sacred tool in the hands of the divine alchemist. Embrace your pain with patience and faith, and you will find that it is not a sign of Allah's absence, but the very instrument that is working to draw you closer to Him and to reveal the profound purpose for which you were created. Watch, reflect, and share. Subscribe to our channel for more beneficial content.